The world is gripped by something called globalization. I'm Fred Harrison of the Land Research Trust in London, and I will explain that globalization is no more than the notion of free trade, and that we should not be blaming globalization for the problems that many people are complaining about in the United States, in Europe, in fact, throughout the world. It's time we came to terms with the importance of free trade and stop blaming globalization, which is the scapegoat for the faults that are really attributable to something else, something very specific, something to do with our governments, which I will explain in this talk. We know that many people in the United States, those who live in what are called the Rust Belt communities, think that they lost their jobs because globalization, meaning trading with other nations, has been unfair to them and has cost them their jobs. Well, look, globalization has been with us for something like 10,000 years. In fact, humanity couldn't have evolved as well as it has done without long-term, long-range trading with other people on the farthest corners of the world. This free trading, this globalization, goes back to neolithic times, when people were still using flintstones as tools. But they exchanged some tools, some stones, some basic materials with others in the far distance from where they lived, so that they could enhance their lives. They were trading what they could create with materials that other people could produce, so that both sides had a better deal than if they were living in isolated communities. That's what trade is all about. Now, that secret of how to prosper through trading, the neolithic secret, let's call it, facilitated the evolution of humanity because there was no government in between obstructing the trade. If one tribal group wanted to exchange flintstones to another tribal group that didn't possess those tools, then there was an exchange of what was considered to be fair value. One group received a commodity, whatever it was, and exchanged it for what they had, and everybody prospered. It was a fair deal. And that principle has continued to this day, with one big exception. Today we have governments which actually, without necessarily intending to do so, which interfere with the free exchange of goods. Understanding that interference means that we would be able to refine the way governments administer their nation states' affairs so that we could all return to international trade. We can renew globalization on the basis that everybody gets a fair deal. I'll come to the solution in a minute, but I have to acknowledge that globalization, as people understand it, does appear to have worked against some communities, both here in Europe and in the United States. We know, for instance, that the incomes of working people have been going down as a share of national income since about the 1970s, 1980s. It's been a steady erosion of people's incomes, and it's not surprising that they had to find an explanation for it. That reality, the erosion of living standards, is something that we need to address. And frankly, it's not being addressed by people like President Trump of the United States. The reality is that the rich have been getting richer and the poor have been getting poorer. We can see that on a graph. The one line goes up, the rich get richer, and the other line shows the deteriorating standard of living of people on the lowest incomes. This is an affront to any decent society, and it needs to be addressed. But it's not being addressed today. And that's why we have the uprising of people who have felt that their interests have been prejudiced. So in the United States, a hedge fund group has monitored the number of people who are voting in elections for non-mainstream politicians, non-mainstream political parties. They've created this index called the World Populism Index, and they've compared this political reaction against the elites with what happened in the 1930s. In the 1930s, the disaffection of many people with the mainstream political parties reached such a height that it created a vacuum in politics which authoritarian individuals were able to occupy. So we had General Franco in Spain, Mussolini in Italy, Adolf Hitler in Germany. They came to power because of this populist reaction against the failures of mainstream governance. And we are dangerously close to that point to this day. The graph which I'm showing you now actually understates the level of disaffection, because it was the situation prior to the recent elections in France, and it doesn't take account of what I expect to happen in Italy and in Germany in the next 12 months. In other words, the world is dangerously close to the levels reached in the 1930s. And that's a sobering thought, isn't it? But governments are paralyzed. They don't know how to deal with this crisis because they don't understand the root cause of problems like inequality, poverty, unaffordable housing. We need to address all these issues because they all contribute to this general reaction which we are now seeing with, for instance, Brexit. Britain decided to withdraw from the European Union because a lot of people, particularly up in the north of England, felt that their Rust Belt communities had been damaged by being part of the European Union. They're wrong to blame the Union as an association of countries, but nobody's explaining to them what is really at the heart of the problem, and I'll attempt to do so in a minute. But in the meantime, people like Donald Trump managed to exploit this feeling among people that there's something radically wrong. And of course, that's how he got himself elected as the president of the United States. Now, perhaps one of the most sobering indicators of the existential crisis that our Western society faces is shown by interest rates. For 5,000 years, interest rates have bobbed along, averaging something like 5%, and the world seems to have managed to evolve, yes, with booms and slumps, with retreats to dark ages, but somehow we've managed to evolve for 5,000 years until now. Now the interest rates have slumped to zero or even negative for the first time in 5,000 years. That is an indication of something fundamentally wrong with the global economy, and especially the Western economy. But what is wrong? Whatever it is, what we do know is that governments are frightened. They're frightened to raise interest rates for fear of something going wrong. They fear something going wrong because they don't understand what could go wrong, what they could do to prevent something going wrong. So they have the austerity policies which clamp down on people's economic activities, which is absurd, of course, because after 2008, the global economy, and certainly Europe's and North America's economy, crashed. And we needed to restart the economies, and you don't restart the economy by imposing austerity on people and creating even more unemployment. But the governments don't understand the fundamentals of why that slump occurred, and therefore they don't understand how to get out of it. So that's why people now use scapegoats like globalization. Oh, it must be the fault of the Chinese because they're selling us cheap goods, for instance, or the Indians because of their call centers, which are undermining the wage rates in Britain or in the United States. But these are scapegoat explanations. They're not the reality. So now we're in a situation where Donald Trump exploits the tragedy of the Rust Belt communities and is elected on the promise to make America great again. And he's threatening to do this. Well, actually, it's more than a threat now, to somehow clamp down on globalization, to renegotiate the trade deals with other countries, as if by doing this, he's actually going to recreate jobs in America. This anti-globalization or anti-free trade doctrine won't actually succeed. It will only add further turmoil in the markets once he starts to renegotiate the trade deals that already exist and create that kind of havoc that actually does damage people's lives. It's not the fault of Mexican workers that they can produce good products that American consumers want to buy at competitive prices. I stress again that ultimately, as I shall shortly explain, the fault lies with the way governments choose to tax their workers within their own territories. This is where the problem lies, and if we could find a solution to that, then we would be able to re-establish free trade on the basis of mutual gain. The Americans and Mexicans would profit even further. Europe could start to restart its economy on principles where communities could start to rebuild themselves from the devastation caused by the IMF's austerity measures, for example. So what I'm telling you is that the fake news from President Trump that he can bring jobs back to America is something that you really need to look closely at. What's going to happen, for example, if the trade deals between America and other countries are diminished in some way, is that attempts will be made to restart factories in America, yes, but most of the jobs will be automated. Employers will naturally want to keep their costs down, which means that they're not going to employ expensive labor if they have alternative, robotic, cheaper ways of conducting their business. That makes good sense economically. It doesn't mean that people are going to get their jobs back or that the Rust Belt towns are going to start flourishing again. They won't. There is no way to turn back the tide of technology. Artificial intelligence will be used to replace people in the future, whatever President Trump does. We need to know how to deal with that problem so that robots are good news for everybody rather than bad news. But in the meantime, something terrible has happened in the world. Because of President Trump's position, he is ceding authority in the global power structure to others, particularly to China. The balance of power is being shifted away from the West, away from America, and to the advantage of the East, the Asian economies, and China and Russia. And we can't blame China and Russia for stepping in and filling the vacuum if the President of the United States, who is supposed to be the leader of the free world, chooses deliberately to look inwards rather than to have this global view of the world of the well-being of humanity at large, including, of course, all American citizens. Well, by ceding authority to others, America immediately starts to put itself at a disadvantage. That's the irony. As it becomes weaker, far from being able to negotiate good trade deals with other countries, America's hand becomes weaker, and that is to the disadvantage of the people of the United States. So we now live in this multipolar world, and we have to understand not only how we came to this tragic situation, but what we're going to do about it. Because we can't allow the uncertainties which will surface in the form of political chaos, and we've got enough of that now, and potentially military chaos. Again, there's enough of that with terrorism, with hacking, and so on, which are elements of a future world war, which mustn't be allowed to take hold. We need to rebuild relationships between nations, and the best way of doing that is with a free trading relationship between nations of the kind that's to the mutual advantage of everybody concerned. So the big problem is to understand why globalization is treated as the scapegoat and what we do about it. Now, there is a well-established theory which we can attribute to a long line of theorists who've explained the basis of an efficient trading relationship. The most articulate exponent of free trade was an American journalist called Henry George, who wrote a book called Progress and Poverty, and then subsequently published a book called Free Trade. And he lays out in technicolor detail the justification for the freedom of people to trade between countries. But going back before Henry George, there was Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations to attack governments that treated trading as a means to glorify the state rather than to emancipate the people who worked for their living and who could have got more prosperous by having the freedom to trade with others. Adam Smith said what we needed to achieve liberty was a new kind of tax system where government paid for public services out of the rents of land. He called this the annual ground rent, which landowners would pay to fund public services. Henry George in the 19th century then went to develop that thesis in the most eloquent of terms. So the history of changing the tax regime in order that we would create a level playing field between people as individuals and between nations is a well-established one in the literature. But how would this actually lead to the renewal of communities and their relationships between nations? We need to look at that a little more closely. Because, well, it was all very well for Adam Smith to say, he called it this peculiar tax. Impose a peculiar tax and pay for public services out of the rents of land, and apparently all would be well. Well, how would it all be well? People can't really understand, can't grasp the intricacies of what's involved. And we need to explore these in more detail so that people can start to direct their attentions away from politicians who are actually charlatans towards the advocates of a rational reforms that actually empower people to live fuller lives and in harmony with their neighbours being the people down the street or across the border in a neighbouring country or on the other side of the world. Let's look at how this would work in relation to the community of nations who have signed up to the Treaty of Rome and have become part of the European Union. Why did Britain decide it wanted to quit that relationship? Those who wanted to stay in the European Union say that, look, we had free trade within Europe. There were no tariffs at the borders between Britain and the 27 other member nations. That's got to be a good thing, hasn't it? Well, put simply like that, yes. But there's more to it. Across Europe, individual nations are governed on the basis of tax regimes that damage people's opportunities to find employment, to earn the incomes they want for their families. That damage caused by the tax regimes has consequences. One of the consequences is this within the European Union. In the peripheral countries, like in the Balkans, down to Greece, southern Italy, Spain, Ireland, the regions on the periphery of the European Union, the tax burden is heaviest, particularly on the people whose productivity is at the low end. And when governments impose taxes on the wages and the consumption of those people, they find that they lose their jobs. They become uneconomic to employers. So what happens? This drives migration. People have to uproot themselves, leave their home communities where they can't find jobs, where they can't find homes at rents they can afford, and go and look for work in the centres of the European Union, London, Berlin, Paris, and so on. Now, the European Union doctrine is that this is good. They say we have 4 freedoms: the freedom of movement of people, capital, services, and goods. Well, for whom is this good? Not for the workers in the Balkan countries or in southern Spain, southern Italy, in Greece, who are being driven out of their homes. They don't leave because they choose. It's not a question of a choice for many of them. They are driven to migrate because ultimately the pricing mechanism used by their governments actually drives them from their home communities. This is an outrage, but there is no discussion at this level of debate within the European Union and the political circles. And there's no concession of this in Brussels, where the commissioners defend the free movement of people as if it's a virtue, when in fact the free movement of people is a safety valve. It's a safety valve for them and the governments that use a tax regime that exploits people, that is not in the best interests of people. So this tax regime that we have in Europe creates hostility between groups, between regions, between nations, and it reached the point where one nation, Britain, decided it wanted to leave. Now, that wasn't a decision made on rational grounds of people understanding that the tax system within Europe is a bad one. They just knew that people flooding into their communities, particularly in the north of England, were competing for the wages in the labour market and driving down the wages of local workers. So naturally, they were going to focus their attention on incoming migrants. But those incoming migrants also had a grievance against their governments back home. So the resolution is to find a way of establishing harmony between nations by, in the first instance, restructuring the tax system within each member state's political system. Now, according to the Treaty of Rome and the subsequent arrangements that govern the European Union, they have structured the rules of the game to achieve a convergence of all economies, to achieve similar efficiency across the economic space. Convergence is their word. But the actual reality is divergence. And the only way to understand how that works is by understanding the theory of rent. Now, the theory of rent was developed by a man called David Ricardo. He explained that rent is not the same across an economic space. It's highest at the center, where productivity is highest, and then rents slope away to the margin. The significance of that is this. He explained that at the margin, at the economic periphery of an economy, productivity is inevitably at its lowest, if only because the costs of transportation of exported goods from the margin to the center, where population tends to be densest, means that the costs are higher for transporting goods to the marketplace from the Balkans, say, or from Greece to Paris or to Berlin. And therefore, this is at the expense of rents. Rents being the only source of revenue that can be taxed by government. Now, if the tax rate is higher than the surplus income or the rents that are being generated in an economy, how can the people living in those regions pay those taxes? If the taxes take more than the rents, then inevitably the taxes fall on people's wages or on the profits of their enterprises. But people can't work for less than a living wage. So if their living wage is reduced by taxes to the point where they can't support themselves and their families, they have to uproot themselves and go and find work elsewhere. This is not the freedom to migrate that the people in Brussels celebrate as if it's a wonderful principle. People are actually being driven away from their homes by a tax regime. So, for instance, in Europe, we have the value-added tax. Professor Mason Gaffney has established that the losses of economic activity within the European Union, because our nation governments levy VAT, is something like 1 trillion euros every year. That's the burden, 1 trillion euros of wealth and welfare that would be produced by people if they were not burdened by VAT. And remember, that lost revenue is just from one of the bad taxes. Think what the people of Europe could do with an extra 1 trillion worth of resources if they were free to produce them, because the governments chose to raise revenue in a way that did not interfere with their productive activities. We could be spending that 1 trillion extra euros on hiring the nurses we need in our hospitals, the teachers in our schools, and so much more could be done with all that extra revenue. Think of the United States. That famous land speculator, Donald Trump, would never undertake to introduce a reform that said, let's raise revenue from the rent of land. Obviously not, because he, as one of the arch land speculators of North America, would find himself having to pay for all the services which his properties were receiving in the locations where he had his casinos and hotels. But by drawing the revenue from that source, it would be possible for the American state and municipal governments to reduce the taxes that damage people's economic activities, and we would return to full employment and the renewal of the Rust Belt communities that are now languishing in despair. So, coming back to Europe, if we want to kickstart the economy to achieve prosperity between all the trading nations within Europe, which is supposed to be a free trade area, the only successful way of doing it is by rebalancing the tax regime. It's relearning what Adam Smith and Henry George taught so many years ago, the principles of which are now clearly advocated by Nobel Prize economists like Joseph Stiglitz. So there's no controversy over the effectiveness of the annual ground rent payment into the public purse. And by making that payment, we could reduce the bad taxes correspondingly, so there would not be a net increase in the tax burden. It would just be a rebalancing to start with, so that people could finally start to return to work, earn a decent living without the burden of taxes. I explained how Europe could achieve this in a book called Beyond Brexit. I outlined this policy in terms of a blueprint. And there is no discussion between Britain and the European Union, which is now having to renegotiate the terms of a new future trading relationship, because the policymakers, the politicians, are not being told by their economic advisors that this strategy for rebalancing the tax regime actually exists. So, as a consequence of that, Greece continues to suffer terribly. There is mass unemployment, particularly among young people, of more than 20%. Lives are being ruined, and the ruin will last for the whole of a generation. This is not a passing phase. So we need to now have a thorough investigation into the terms under which countries can engage in trading between themselves. We need to relearn the secret of the neolithic people, who were able to exchange products over long distances as long ago as 10,000 years ago to their mutual advantage. Of course, life now is more complicated. We have urban civilization, we have governments, and we do have to raise revenue to pay for a lot of complex public services. But the efficient way to do it, the way that doesn't get in the way of producing goods and services and creating prosperity for everybody, is to raise that revenue from the rents of land, from the rents of natural resources like the electromagnetic spectrum, the radio spectrum that we use for our cell phones. At the moment, governments are allowing the spectrum rents to be handed out, given away, almost free. That explains why the corporations like Google and Apple are worth tens of billions of dollars. Most of that revenue that is captured in their share values is actually the rent of a natural resource which ought to be going into the public purse. And if it was, we would have fewer problems with those internet companies, and we would diminish the taxes that damage people's economic activities, and there would be friendship and mutual respect between nations, rather than the tensions that are now bubbling up as people like President Trump says he's going to renege on past trade deals and insist on renegotiating them in the interests of making America great again. There is a way to make America great again, and that is to retreat to the philosophies that were discussed in the past. I've told you about Henry Georgist, and you should look up his book on free trade, because that is the blueprint for a peaceful global trading situation that would restore globalization back to where it belongs. One of the glues, one of the cements that joins up nations and delivers prosperity for everybody. Thank you.